Can you believe it? We've reached the Centennial. In honor of that, I'm back in like podcast jail in my bedroom here. My wife is working downstairs, so I can't have the normal space. But it's appropriate that I'm in this sort of like design-free neutral zone for those who are watching, because we're talking to David Michon, who is the author of Forescale, which is a newsletter about design, interior decor, and all of the pop culture and gestalt that it implies in the choices that people make around, decor, decoration, design. I was just going to say, David, I've been reading the newsletter for a long time, and I think it's so interesting and characteristic, and I want to talk to you about specifically the reasons why. But in the meantime, welcome.
Thank you so much. I had no idea this was number 100. I feel totally honored.
Well, it's like I said, to
impose on this, like that it's a special occasion, but congratulations to you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, I don't know that congratulations is even necessary. As I was saying to Mo, my guest last week, who was a bit bereft that he was close to 100 and didn't make it, I was like, if there's any planning had gone into this whatsoever, there would be a reason to feel a type of way about it. But there wasn't, so don't. Anyway, but I am very pleased about it, and I like of course the what is the word? The sort of symmetry or the clean exponents of the 10 by 10 like grid, right? To be, if we're talking to a design thinker or a design expert. Will you? How did you? Explain Forescale for us, if you don't mind.
Sure. There are actually, I think with many things, there are like several ways to like to kind of tell the story of its origin.
Sure.
I mean, the most simple one is simply that I had actually kind of been working on this project, and it was sort of like not a success, and it was a lot about the design world, and particularly domestic interiors and domestic spaces, and a way that I saw them, maybe that I thought was that was shared amongst a lot of my friends or people that I kind of spoke with, but wasn't really reflected anywhere. And then when that kind of like fizzled out, it was a kind of like app startup thing, as kind of like often happens to people when they like.
This is the project that didn't succeed. It was okay. Got it. Sure.
Yeah. And so it was with the kind of like pent up energy and the thinking and the time spent kind of on the subject in my mind that I then kind of just brought something back into my kind of wheelhouse, which is writing, and started this Substack that was about domestic interiors. And I think a lot of it was a reaction to, I guess, the established design media, which was, I felt, kind of like becoming increasingly narrow. There was a lot of similarity between the kind of glossy magazines that you'd see
Sure.
on the newsstands and kind of the way that they talked about interiors and kind of the lens that they used to look at kind of like why things were important, and reliance on like trend and celebrity, which are things that I don't really kind of speak about.
Well, they shouldn't be, which shouldn't be good, or they shouldn't be valid barometers for design choices. Like, people's taste is people's taste, but like going, Ben Affleck chose this thing, so therefore it's good, is like, twisted.
Very bad. Yeah. And I think there's a place for all of that. I mean, I'm like also curious about these spaces and whatever. And I think
Sure.
a lot of people do connect with trend, obviously, which is why there's like a reliance on that, because they kind of want some direction. But it felt like that was like the only thing that kind of was the only way people were talking about design.
Sure.
I mean, there are other, Apartamento magazine, for example, is something that maybe sits outside of that. And it's really a lot more for me about the people as opposed to like the design per se.
Sure.
This was a little bit kind of like a version that was more about arrangements and objects and things.
Yeah.
And so that's
Oh, sorry to cut you off. I just think have been interested to talk to you for a really long time, and I'm glad that Danny Giacopelli was able to introduce us. Because Forescale has such an incredibly specific, or maybe not specific, but characteristic language and tone and vernacular, right? It's everything from the all caps style in deployed in certain places through to the sort of convivial conversational way that you're talking to your audience, but doing so in a like it's using a set of languages and references that I, as a non-design native, let's call it, don't really understand. And the other person who does something like that, who I know, is Sammy Reese at Snake. Sammy, I've met in person, and so you sort of understand how his personality in IRL comes through in the written word. I was so interested to meet you, so to speak, and talk to you like this, because I was like, is this guy going to talk in all caps? Yeah, exactly. Where does that come from?
First of all, I'll say I love Sammy. He's contributing to
cool.
second print issue of Forescale, which I'm very excited about. And this kind of
cool
stream of consciousness about Michael Graves, which is going to be great.
Interesting. The author of the famous tea kettle, among many other things.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think first of all, it's like a little bit of an experimentation. I think like Substack, for I'm sure a lot of writers who are kind of like were professionally writing, is probably the first time they've been writing for themselves, like totally unedited. So it felt like an interesting opportunity to experiment a bit, I guess, to kind of like play around with format. And I think there was a little bit of an attempt to, again, kind of like be obviously a reaction to like the formality of other magazines and kind of like
I got you.
We're writing. And I think a lot of that is like, you know, there are these designs, like every design story is kind of just like written like a typical story is like beginning, middle, and I don't know, it's like continuous prose or whatever, you know, that's kind of unchallenged. And so I think, you know, a big inspiration for like also how it's formatted, which is like sometimes lists, sometimes like longer paragraphs, sometimes very short little aphorisms or statements, and sometimes images, is like a little bit of a reflection, I think, of how we kind of like scroll the internet now, which is like sometimes you dwell on something, sometimes like something within that makes you want to just like quickly, you know, take a tangent and like return. Sometimes you scroll really fast through something and you're kind of just processing information super quickly. So it's like pace is different. And I think when you kind of like need a visual reference for something, you know, writing for a traditional magazine, you don't know what images will be used or where they'll be placed.
Right, sure.
Here, you obviously you have control of that. So sometimes you just say like, here's an example, like boom, or whatever, and then you move on. You don't have to like describe. So there's also a kind of economy somewhere in there. And so, yeah, I think it was just fun to play with the format and to play with like what is actually like my written tone of voice, like if I'm uninhibited or something.
Right, sure.
And then I think not to kind of like totally dwell on this, but there's a slight kind of like meta level also, which is that a big kind of like a value of Forescale, let's say, when talking about interiors is kind of like permissiveness, like asking people to kind of also experiment and to kind of like lean into their own personal taste and style. And so I guess it's kind of like a written ode to a permissiveness.
Oh, well, yeah, that's interesting. It's sort of like a get in, losers. We're going to wherever it is, and like this is the car we're going in, and so like look out this window, not just whatever window you thought you were going to look out of. Yeah, that's interesting. One of the things that I was instantly beguiled by that the distinctiveness and foreignness, for me anyway, of that approach, right? Which I thought was super cool, and I love things like that. The other thing that I thought was interesting was that you, from very early on in my awareness of Forescale, were doing things to hack the way that the Substack orthodoxy works. Like you have here, I will show up to the camera, a hat that I bought from you, which just says furniture. Yeah. This I don't know how many newsletters in you were before you started making merch, but it was pretty early. And I was just like, okay, this is somebody who is looking at this as an ecosystem, not as a blog or whatever, right?
Yeah, that's
You did
very,
you so there's products, and then there was the printed publication, of which Sammy is apparently contributing to the second one. There was the launch event at Colbo, which I didn't unfortunately make, but so it's like you're getting out into IRL, and then you went to almost like very quickly. You were over at Salone. I think it was Salone, under with the support of USM. Was it USM? With the
yeah.
support of USM, and I'm just like, okay, so this is a guy who has figured out the fact that the platform is a platform, not a shackle, and
Yeah.
so it's like, let's have some fun with it.
Okay, fun. There's a lot to say in there, actually. One, I think like it was important for me for this to be something that felt like it wasn't just like a digital thing.
Sure.
And I can't say that like necessarily early on I had grand ambitions or that I have like grand ambitions now, but because there's also something very precious about a personal project that you don't
Sure.
want to, kind of like, this is me being a bad capitalist, but it's like my my instinct isn't to like monetize stuff immediately.
Sure.
It was just like a really wonderful kind of expression. But I also think, I think what we've seen with other platforms over time is also that they become like less and less interesting.
For
And
sure.
yeah, because there's, the incentive for Substack is to kind of like, they have investors, I assume.
Yes, they do.
I would assume. And, I'm sure they want to like IPO someday or like whatever. They also want to be like making money. And so they'll follow wherever that money is. And you can see like, as Substack develops, it's like what they have, like, the features that they are introducing are like live video or like increased like shopping capabilities and whatever. These are like not necessarily like a writer's tools.
Sure. Yeah.
So, I think what kind of has made Substack what it is that it wasn't just kind of like a newsletter platform, like a Beehive or something.
Sure.
It felt like it was geared towards writers. It was a way for writers to kind of like try and make some money from their writing. It was very driven by those types of people. And I don't know if that's like always the case or necessarily the case even anymore. So I think kind of going into it, it's also like, well, I feel like there's a mission behind Forescale. It can't only kind of exist in the realms of this platform over which I have no control.
Sure.
That was a long-winded answer to you.
But no. Okay. But I thought, okay, following and tracking with all that, and I agree with you. The thing that I thought was especially interesting was in the USM example. So just to take us back to that for those who didn't see it, USM, which is the modular furniture company, high-end modular furniture company that makes all of the geometric stuff in bright colors that you've seen in all of the rap videos. It's fantastic stuff. Like I covet it, but it also is. It occupies a very particular sort of place in the aesthetic universe. They sent you to Salone di Mobile in 2024.
Yes, and again this year.
And this year too. Okay, so
yeah. And also Miami in December. They're big supporters.
So this is a way to take what could be construed as advertising dollars. Could be, isn't. I don't know. It's not necessarily what you construe it, but it could be, to take what can be construed as advertising dollars to support your editorial mission, your personal exploration of the space, your personal network, so on and so forth. And they do so for the associative value of being in this, sort of premium publication, and hoping to gain the benefit of your endorsement should you choose to deliver it. That's a very biz dev led approach to like subsidizing what you want to do with the newsletter. And I don't think most, which and this is my background.
Mm.
So I saw it and I was just like, oh my God, thankfully David is figuring it out. I hope he's a beacon for everybody else. The number of people who have similarly figured it out is not very big. And so I just thought like the fact that you caught into that immediately was really like, I love it. I think it's really excellent, but I also think it's says something about you as a, I don't know what, a publisher, a world builder, whatever.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that like going to Salone del Mobile, which is Milan Design Week, for those who don't know, like the biggest furniture fair in the calendar every year in April, it's phenomenally expensive. I mean, particularly
Sure.
from Los Angeles, it's like a huge trip, and then the hotels are like quadruple or like 5 times the typical,
Sure.
the usual price. And so it's not a place you can really like go kind of unsupported, or very few
Right.
people can. Some people, I guess, do.
There are those. There
Yeah,
are those.
and the resources to go unsupported. Would I love it if like Forescale had so many paid subscribers that I could kind of like swallow that type of expense? Sure, yes. But I think that certainly the next best thing is kind of getting the support of a brand like USM, which I already love, which I have like so much respect for. And I think, we connected for 2 reasons. One is very much their kind of US MD, John Thorson, who's just like a very cool guy. And I think if you look at USM's like recent collaborations, like at least in the US, they're with some interesting people, and they're not
Sure.
necessarily people with like enormous social media followings or like enormous kind of like name recognition, but they're people with some cool perspective. And so, huge kudos to John Thorson for like, you don't have to like explain yourself to him. He like gets it. So that's really amazing. And also, I think, what I feel, not to kind of like put words in his mouth, but I think what they feel is that, or what he feels about Forescale is that there is kind of like a refreshing approach that Forescale takes. And so
Totally.
something as popular and known as USM, I think there's something valuable in that kind of offering a fresh take. Like, how is it that you find a fresh take on something that, at least in the design world, is like totally ubiquitous?
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I really strive for. And in places where I've done other kind of that's kind of like straight up advertising. They have like header and footer ads, and the exchanges that also obviously like visit what USM is doing, and
Sure.
like incorporate that into what I'm writing about. Never like a dedicated post, but like within these kind of like thematic or kind of like omnibus posts, like to
Sure.
to connect it into that. But there have been other cases where I've done collaborative content, let's say. So like with a brand, like they'll sponsor a post, and I think it's also been really interesting to kind of like work that out. And like for example, one was this pretty small, medium-sized brand out of San Francisco. It's called Fearn, which does
Okay.
they have this kind of like also like a slightly modular system of like tables and chairs where you can like switch out the brackets and the seats and whatever. It's very elegant.
Interesting. Okay.
And that was an essay about timelessness, because we were just having a conversation and they were like, oh, it's not really like, doesn't really feel like the right word, or it's an overused word, or what does it mean? And people kind of apply it to us, but it doesn't really like resonate. And so
Sure.
so that was a pretty kind of like philosophical essay about timelessness and what it means. And that's been like actually one of the most popular Forescale posts. So I'm kind of proud that it's not like, I think you see some other people approach, maybe a kind of brand partnership, and we'll be like, okay, well, we'll mention your brand like 3 times, and there'll be like link to product and like whatever. And it was like none of those things. It was like, of course I presented it as like I was having this conversation, just as I told you, I was having this conversation with Fear, and we were talking about timelessness, and like they've kind of asked me to write about it, which is exactly what happened. Um, and yeah, I feel proud that I was kind of like able to carry like a brand partnership into the space of like a weird essay about like timelessness versus longevity, and like timelessness for who, and like whatever that
Sure.
means. And so yeah, I think that's also something that I'm kind of having fun with.
That's cool. I made a presentation at a big CPG brand last week, and one of the things that I said to them about this burgeoning space, what I, like I refer to it as parasocial media, but it's around, newsletters, podcasts, that kind of stuff, is that the publishers, and when I say publishers, I mean, as you would say, call yourself an author or the author of Forescale, publishers are much more interested in having conversations like that than they have been in the past. Like the job of a publisher before was to create a business plan and to create commodified placements that could be thought of as inventory, and make it as easy as possible to fill that inventory at a going rate. It was the job of editorial people to resist the commercial pressure of the publisher to do something that they didn't want to do or didn't feel editorial integrity in. But in my mind, having grown up on fashion magazines and skateboarding magazines, like where the edit is the ad and the ad is the edit, right? It comes together as a whole. I've always felt like those things were able to be combined in a way that is really natural, so long as it actually represents the intention and feeling of the editorial purveyor, and it actually provides insight or value to the audience, because the commercial partner then gets the benefit of that authentication and that sort of discovery. But I just don't hear a lot of people. I more and more I hear writers beginning to cotton to that idea that they can do both, or that
Mm.
both things can be true. But I don't see a lot of examples. So whatever. I'm going to continue to praise your intuition in finding that
Yeah,
balance.
yeah, I think I think you're right. I mean, the reality is also that it's very hard. It would be very hard to be totally independent of that. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
brands are kind of patrons at this point. We writers, um, you know, you're it's just a very underpaid kind of it's an
Right.
underpaid career, and people are very used to getting content for free. It's like it is kind of like a pain to convince people to pay on Substack. I also don't necessarily want to put things behind a paywall. I kind of like the idea
Mm-hmm.
that they can be shared widely and that people can read them and not feel like a barrier to that. And so the response, I guess, kind of has to be that there's like some brands of poor, but it should fit.
Right. Sure.
Yeah, but it should fit. But that's also like a creative challenge, I think. Like how do you kind of like fit that in? Like what's a Forescale version of this?
That's where I get excited, and that's what I like, and I appreciate that I appreciate people who can see it from that standpoint, because it's sort of like there are things that are just bad,
Yeah.
right? Skechers being one example in my life. Fucking hate Skechers. Um, but 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 with most other things, there is the question of like, okay, if this thing is in my life and provides some level of value, is there a way that I can translate it into this oeuvre? How would I do that? What would be the necessary step that would have to be taken, or risk that would have to be taken? Do I feel comfortable doing that? Does the counterparty feel comfortable doing that? And it becomes this exciting creative problem solving exercise, I think. Um,
Yeah,
anyway,
I would love to do more. I would love to do more things with brands, kind of like outside of Substack. That's certainly something that I think is maybe part of Forescale 2.0. Let's say is
sure.
is yeah, again, kind of like trying to translate that into other realms.
Let's talk about that for a second, because I want to, obviously those who listen regularly know that the theme of this conversation is supposed to be, it rarely is, but it's supposed to be what my guest thought was interesting from the list of links that that I'm going to publish in SIC on Thursday. And you gave me some stories, which we'll talk about in just a second. But one thing I wanted to mention is there is a story that I'm linking to from Interview. It is an interview between Mel Ottenberg, the EIC over there, and DJ Glur, who is one half of Inflagranti, the Swiss-German disco duo, but also he made a bunch of mixtapes for Smile on Nylon, the vintage boutique in 90s New York. Anyway, the reason I bring it up is that what Mel said in the interview is that his friends at Casa Magazine say their best customers are 18-year-olds, which I thought was really interesting. And I wondered, in your producing a print object, if you think about audience expansion, essentially, like I'm not getting the 18-year-olds here because they don't have the depth of reference, but if I put something in their hands that they can look at and feel, then maybe that brings them on board. Or alternately, you're just like, I'm making this for my 65-year-olds who can't look at a computer screen because they can't look at a computer screen.
I wish I was that considerate.
All right, fair enough.
I think, my background is print. Like you mentioned, Danny Giacopelli, who you've had on this podcast, and I know him from working at Monocle. Monocle is like a very, we were both there like a lifetime ago, but obviously a very like print focused brand and publication. And I think there's something to be said about print, and just in terms of like, yeah, it feels like a real commitment to something.
Sure.
And I think there was also just kind of also return to kind of like how Forescale is a reaction to maybe a lot of it established design print. I think a lot of it is, it's like it's all the same format. It's really glossy. It's kind of like designed to be put on a shelf, and like the spines all look beautiful, like next to one another. And
sure.
And so the first print issue was this like big, broadsheet format newspaper, which is like cumbersome to read and, recyclable and like you can trash it, it's not that expensive. And so that was also kind of like a little bit of a reaction. And, the first issue, like visually, if you've seen it or like have a chance to look at it, it's like every article is kind of like approached slightly differently. It's like, it's very like cacophonous and, again, like very, I think very, very loose in terms of like its line and super visual. And I think that was like a reaction a bit to like the grid, like the graphic design grid, even though there is some of that, of course. And, the second issue, which we're putting together now, has like almost no images or like very, very few.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so I think that's also a different type of reaction, which is like, okay, like a lot of these magazines people are looking at, you buy World of Interiors and you like, I would guess like most people kind of like flick through it and look at it and they'll like read captions to understand the image, but like, we're not necessarily like reading them. And so this was a kind of a cue for people to like read as opposed to just look. So
interesting.
It doesn't lean on imagery.
Got it. That's fascinating. I mean, I would love to say that I read magazines in particular as much as I would like to. I still accumulate magazines at the rate that I always have, maybe even more than I ever used to. But I spend a lot more time flicking through, and particularly, something like the New Yorker, for instance, I read New Yorker content all the time on computer, on my phone. I
Mm.
get the print magazine and I love the print magazine and will always want to receive it, but I
It's just like
hardly
really,
ever read it.
yeah,
Well, it's about, I mean, to a certain degree, it's about usage occasion, right? Like you have to at a certain point commit to sitting down with the thing and not multitasking and not tabbing between various things and so on and so forth, like the phenomenon that you described earlier. And it is a commitment, but I think it's to Mel's observation, or to the Casa magazine folks' observation. I think there's a certain hunger for that as a like mental health. Mental health is overrated, but you know what I'm saying, like, or overused is what I meant to say. But it's a hunger to take a pause for a second
yeah,
and do something, I don't know, actively with your brain instead of passively with it.
yeah. I mean, I can't purport to like understand the mind of an 18-year-old a long time ago.
Let me know. I've got a freshman in college who
Okay,
I would
yeah.
like explained in that case.
Yeah, but I do think that is interesting. I mean, I think I can talk about, observations in terms of, younger people and their approach to, design and domesticity. Where I think, it's certainly starting to rival wardrobe in terms of like how people kind of flex, or where people kind of like
Mm-hmm.
put effort in terms of like personal expression. And I think that's super interesting because I think there's something actually kind of nice about like how how kind of irreverent people are in terms of like design history or categories, like kind of it's
What do you mean?
it's like you see people who kind of like they're brought into this world somehow. I think there's a lot of amazing, like, I think the most interesting entry point is like a lot of resellers who are like a kind of new generation of like antique people
Sure.
who are like
Sure.
surfacing interesting things, recontextualizing them, they sell them, kind of alongside stuff they've like commissioned from their friends and like stuff they've done or whatever. It's like looser, it's
Sure.
not just kind of like ideal in kind of like post-war, mid-cent, whatever. The categories are not really important. It's kind of like it's like a taste level. It's a taste. It's a personal taste.
Sure.
And I think some people and they're great at Instagram and like whatever. So I think some people are kind of brought in for that. And the whole point of view of that is, to me, like that these things, they're just cool, like looking. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
It's like maybe it's great that it's like a Castiglione lamp or whatever, and like you find out about that afterwards, but you kind of appreciate that it's like some just cool looking lamp at first.
That's so funny. That reminds me. It's a very, very specific thing that just brought to mind. There was a zine put out in the summer of 2003
Mm,
called "How to Be Fashionable or Consume Like Me," by a guy named Andrew Coulter Enright, and
sounds amazing.
Andy.
Pretty sold.
Andy at the time, he was like, fresh out of college, living in New York, trying to make sense of it. And he created this like guide of, how to be cool in his little world. And it was meant to be self-effacing and funny, but it's also it's very on point. It's very well observed and very on point. It was made as like an edition of 200, sold exclusively through a couple of fashion boutiques in Williamsburg. And it was like this cultural object in that summer. Anyway, it's now available as a PDF online. Maybe I'll put it. I have put it in the newsletter before, but I'll put it in again this week as a function of this discussion. Anyway, in that newsletter, or in that book or zine, there is advice, and it is things like wear your t-shirts ever so slightly too small. Um, like put on 4 accessories, shift them around, take one off, right? Don't love or hate LA, tolerate LA. But the one that came to mind as you were talking was there's a one where it's like, wake up on a stranger's couch, later realize it was an Eames original. And
Yeah,
that I love that notion. It's just
yeah,
like, go ahead and be an idiot,
yeah,
but then like be circumspect enough about the fact that you were an idiot to realize that there are things at play that make that experience richer.
yeah,
I
yeah.
thought,
Scratch beneath the surface.
yeah,
I also
exactly.
think like there's something probably in that there's like a little bit of like how these cool design pieces are being contextualized
Mm-hmm.
people's like how people are kind of like putting them in their homes, which is like if you think about like some Eames original sofa or whatever, I don't know, you picture this like design within reach interior or something. It feels like a little bit inaccessible because you think like, well, I can't just have like this like $10,000 sofa and like a fucking dump around it or whatever. And I think some people are starting to say like actually the dump around a $10,000 sofa is kind of interesting and
Yeah, for sure.
like more fun to be like to have these like little to have these things kind of like inserted into whatever else your house is doing. And
Yeah,
you don't need to have like a totally perfect place for like something of design quality to like fit in.
yeah, yeah. It's funny. I went to a cocktail party at a friend's house last week, and he is quite a successful media person and has put a good deal of his money, I would say, into design objects, like capital D auction worthy sort of design objects. And I hadn't been to his house in a couple of years, and he and his wife have pushed further and further into that direction. And it was, on the one hand, really, it was kind of cool because it was just like, okay, these are the sorts of things that you see in Sotheby's catalogs, but not really in people's homes.
Hmm.
And on the other hand, it was like, I feel like you might have tipped over a
Yeah,
threshold where you don't use these things anymore. Like you can't sit in that chair anymore. Now the chair is effectively like a sculpture.
yeah.
And I wonder to what extent you as a design writer, as a design thinker, venerate the idea of holding these objects as being, you know, paragons of a particular kind of designer philosophy, or alternately holding them as like objects that are totally utile and lose their purpose if they're not totally utile. Like, where do you live on that continuum?
Hmm. Interesting question. Yeah, I think there is like I think it's interesting to like get to know designers, particularly ones who I think have like, had have been very consistent in terms of like doing interesting things. And those are both like designers of the past and present, or
Sure,
like who seem to, you know, I guess do things with some degree of like attitude. They're not just trying to make like a nice sofa. They have some idea of like what a sofa um should be. And I
sure.
think there's a
Yeah,
lot
yeah,
and I think that's just kind of like where I step into things personally, which is like I'm way more interested in the ideas behind things. And how those kind of like manifest and how you know we there's obviously like the look of something, but then there's like what that thing says about like how you want to live. And I think that's
sure.
where a lot of other design writing maybe like doesn't really get into that so much, particularly when it's like trend reports. They'll just be like, oh, we're still,
Togo.
yeah, exactly. And it's just like, oops, like stainless steel is still a thing. And it's like, okay, well, what vibe is that? Like,
Stainless steel is still a thing.
like
That's funny.
what does that like? Why might you be attracted to that? I think it's
Hmm.
like, if there's some self-reflection in terms of like, why am I looking at this thing and I like it? Is kind of like is the important effort in terms of like developing a personal taste,
Sure,
um, and helps you, I think, step outside of like trend because you're more confident and you're more thoughtful about what it is that you like or don't like because you have
sure,
developed a reason for it. But I think there's lots of there's like a lot of like super cool examples. There's like there's this weird, I forget the name of it. There's like a Castiglione chair, which is like on a rounded bottom, so it like wobbles, and the seat is like a bike seat. Have you seen it?
Sure, I have seen it. Yeah,
I
I'm
completely forget
familiar.
the name of it, but it was like, this is the origin of that chair is like from a time when like telephone calls like cost a lot of money, in fact. So the chair was designed to like sit next to the telephone, and so it was like intentionally a bit kind of like uncomfortable, something that you couldn't like settle into, and so you weren't like lingering on the phone.
Right.
Like for me, that's kind of like, okay, that's like a fun design story, and now it's like a kind of like quirky thing that's like there's a bit of
Well,
it, but
yeah, it's so fun. I mean, I don't know if you're old enough to remember like when long distance calls
yeah, yeah.
were different than regular calls, and mom was like, "Get off the phone. You can't talk to grandma that long," type thing. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Castiglione had a response to that, and I think that's also just kind of like, not that that has some immediate relevance now, but the idea of that for me has some relevance, which is like, okay, like what actually do you want to be happening in spaces, and where
Sure.
do you want to be, like blah 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 blah. Um, and there are infinity examples like that.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, speaking of infinity examples, I am interested to now follow into the premise of this actual conversation, which is to understand what you saw in the SIC list and what you thought was interesting. One of the things that I would like to get to, let's do a couple of things that you picked first, is understanding what your sources of media are, like where you pull primarily from and sort of what your inputs are, because I think that's interesting to see how people reflect against it. But the fire, hold on, I'm sorry, I'm just pulling up the stories now. The one of the stories that you wrote was from the Atlantic, or not wrote, but that you referred to was from the Atlantic Today, and it was about how we are slowly losing the ability to afford our hobbies and what gets lost when that happens. What was it about that headline that grabbed you?
I think what feels kind of interesting about that is, I think there's a lot, it's like, not to be like, I'm going to quickly get it like out of my depth in terms of like cultural theory, but it just felt very kind of like Society of the Spectacle, like Guy Debord,
Mm-hmm. Sure.
where in fact like we're experiencing things, life through like representations, and that feels very much. It's so interesting because like all of these like kind of like cultural theorists like from the '60s, speaking about kind of like representation and technology and like our connection with culture and like a flattening of culture. It's like so relevant.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Of course.
it's like they could have easily written a lot of these essays today. And I think that, so for me, it was kind of like, you know, it's about kind of like bringing things back into your own life in a kind of like in a nice like small way, like these hobbies, I think, are something that are very personal. It's like you don't have to really justify them to other people.
Mm-hmm.
We're so in the habit of sharing those things, but they don't really need to be shared. You don't need to be doing something for any kind of acclaim or like public uh, kind of like response. It's like, what is nice about a hobby is that you can be like a shit knitter. You can be like shit at knitting, but like enjoy the process. It's like,
Guilty.
yeah, exactly. You can be like a horrible painter, but it like it doesn't fucking matter. You're not like, you don't need to be like doing it for other people. And I think, that's also something that I hope for in terms of like people's approach to like making their homes, which
Mm,
is like you can make mistakes and like be bad at it and still like really love it. And you can like really love
sure.
design, but like not know anything, not know much about it, or like want to be learning or whatever. It doesn't fucking matter. But I do think there's something there was something in that headline that felt really nice, just about, or in that headline, for me, the subtext was immediately just about like how actually like precious hobbies are, and like how
Sure.
important it is to kind of like be doing something kind of for yourself. And I think, you know it isn't something, your home isn't something that you need to share. I think that's also something that I find very intriguing about it. Not to like keep circling back just to like domestic interiors and whatever, but the
No,
way,
I'm fascinated.
yeah, the way you dress is, of course, there are ways you dress just in private, but generally speaking, you like get dressed, you go out into the world, like it's something you kind
Yeah,
of, it's kind of like very public in a lot of ways.
sure.
Like your style at home, like honestly, you don't need to share with anyone. I mean, like I'm just showing you like a corner, it's like you don't know what my interior is like, and I think that's kind of nice. I'd be very hesitant to like share what my house is like because it's like not the point. Um, and I think that's something really nice, and that's for me, it's in the
Yeah.
spirit of the hobby.
Well, so what I took away from the assertion of the piece, right, which is that hobbies, and they used knitting and they used fishing, which I thought was a sort of an odd like corner of Bedford Avenue and North Seventh type of juxtaposition. But the examples they used were knitting and fishing, and they were talking about how these things have gotten to be much more expensive than they used to be because the cost of inputs has gone up a lot, right? The cost
Yeah.
of chartering a boat or the cost of materials or whatever the case is. And as I was thinking about it, I was just like, yeah, but the hobbyist doesn't need a particular. You don't have to have a particular bit of gear to go fishing. You don't have to have a particular boat to go fishing. You don't have to have a particular like gauge of yarn to knit. You just need to perform the action. And what we are confronting, and this gets into the flattening society piece that you also picked out that Mo Diggs wrote, was that there is this notion of orthodoxy where if you don't have all of the items in the starter pack, you can't do the thing properly, which is nonsense,
Yeah.
total nonsense. And what I like about what you're saying is that it's and I think the whole impulse of Forescale is that it feels like it's challenging that orthodoxy and saying no, actually you can hew as close to that as you want to, but you don't have to. You can go do something else, like go do something different. And anyway, I agree with that. So of course it's what jumps at me.
Yeah, but I think there is, as soon as these things become, maybe this is also like a kind of like function of social media and like people sharing things where it's like everything is kind of like commodified in a different way and like becoming
Well,
more.
everything you possess takes on the potential of performance in a way that didn't used to be the case,
Yeah.
right? Like this is, I'll show you. It's like little so for those of you who are not watching this, it's a little piggy bank. It's a metal, like cast metal mailbox, and my grandmother wrote Syracuse on it because that's where I grew up. Um, this No one I don't think has ever seen this who hasn't been not only in my house but like in my little office off the
Until
bedroom
now.
until right now.
Yeah.
And 20 years ago no one ever would have.
Yeah.
Today I can put that on grid and make it some statement about,
Yeah.
look at my folksy design sensibility or whatever. And so I don't know. I don't have a point there either. It's just it's a it's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
state of the world, right?
I think it just has so much to do about like, again, it's like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this thing? And if it's really just like a thing that's just for you, then it's like, okay, that you're just doing it at your level.
Right.
I
Yeah.
think that's,
Fully. Well, so the assertion within Mo's flattening of society piece, which he published in Cross Current on Sunday after he and I talked last week, was about how essentially the cultural regression to a mean, as seen through the entertainment business, was on the one hand terrible and like a bad trend, and on the other hand was very similar to what we saw in the 1950s, which then produced, out of a dearth of interesting popular entertainment from the Hollywood system, produced indie cinema, the French New Wave, so on and so forth, like this expansion of the cinematic universe through approach, through vernacular, through internationality, et cetera, et cetera. Which I thought was cool. I guess the question, because design happens at such a industrial, like true design happens at such an industrial scale, like how big, how ubiquitous does a look or a design world have to be before it starts collapsing on itself? or does design not function that way? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. Like, do you mean you mean like, oh, we're in a moment where people are paying much more attention to design, like how long can that last before it's just like we're all
Maybe, I mean, I guess maybe I would think of it more in terms of like mid-century modernism, right? Like when it started in, or it started to really bubble in the, let's call it early 90s. You might know a different time period, or maybe more specifically when, but like it was cool, it was different, it was interesting, and it grew and grew and grew and grew and grew to the point where it's everywhere and boring, and so there's a reaction against it. Now, it doesn't mean that it's any less valid as a system or an approach. It just means that it's not interesting anymore. But that, I think, with the case of MCM, probably happened over 25 years, right? Like, how I don't know. Is there a do you see a sort of a lifespan for those things that is specific to design? That's
Yeah,
kind
I
of the
mean, I guess
question.
it's like shorter and shorter these days.
Sure.
You mentioned the Togo sofa already, which is like a classic example of like something that it kind of had some viral moment, I guess, during the pandemic, and everyone kind of
Right.
like wanted a Togo sofa, and it was to the great annoyance of people who'd been lovers and owners of Togo sofas for many years, and because something's kind of exhausted and it like no longer feels interesting, or there's I think you know when you walk into someone's house you kind of want to slightly read it, so it's
Sure.
like, oh, you see a Togo sofa and you think, oh, why did they choose that, or I haven't seen that before, or something. As soon as you kind of like lose an instinct to question like why someone chose one thing or another, then it's just like, then
Sure.
this space becomes less interesting. And I think for a lot of people who just kind of like followed the trend, this is why trends are so boring and we like cycle through them, is because it's like, well, if you feel nothing for it, it's like, if you don't know,
That's interesting.
if you
It's
if you don't,
if you feel nothing for it,
then
it's
it's never gonna last.
what reason does it have to
This
exist?
is
Yeah,
this is
exactly.
this is like going back to the timelessness essay, where it's like a lot of that was actually about mid-century modern. Of course, everyone says like it's timeless classics, timeless. That's like what people say about it. But I think it's kind of like, well, maybe it's timeless, but is it timeless like for you? Like you're the one that
Right.
has to live with it, and is like a Hans Wegner sideboard timeless for the person whose taste is like postmodernism? It's like, no, because it doesn't it's not theirs, so
Sure.
it doesn't suit them or their tastes. So maybe it says something about like, I think a lot of what kind of like a, a lot of what was going through the minds of mid-century designers was about kind of like designing for as many people as possible.
Sure.
There, there was, and so I think that's why it's kind of maintained a popularity, or people kind of consider that timeless, is because the philosophy behind it was like pretty democratic.
Was in service of, right, an egalitarian impulse. Yeah. Intriguing. You said that you could riff about embroidery,
Yes.
changing the subject entirely.
Yeah.
So this embroidery story is, let me just pull it up really quickly, in Hyperallergic, and it ties a little bit to the knitting thing, but it's about the feminist revival of embroidery, which was once denounced as women's work with no artistic merit, but it is now experiencing a revival with a feminist punch. what was it on that
Yeah, I mean, like
that
I,
grabbed you?
I love Judy Chicago, which I think they make an example of in that article, and
Yeah, yeah, she's amazing.
I guess I think there's something. Um, I just think it's an interesting play of like something that is kind of like decorative, but also incredibly humble. That's like,
Hmm.
that is that shows also like the range of something like embroidery, where it's like embroidery can be incredibly traditional. I think if you spoke to the average person and you said like imagine embroidery, it would be probably something very, very kind of
It'd be Gus right here. Like,
yeah, exactly. It'd be like Gus, or it's like maybe if they're thinking about it in decorative terms, it's probably not something like weird and
sure,
graphical.
it's flowers and it's cutesy and folksy and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so it's kind of like nice to see something kind of be acknowledged as like having like such a vocal range, let's say. Again, I think I think it's cool to see kind of like people play with things like that. And I also think there's something, um, there's, th- it's also kind of like a little bit hobby. It's a little bit crafty.
Hmm.
It's like,
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
there's also that kind of range where it's like these things are, these things kind of like operate on a like high artistic level and like a kind of like personal hobby level. Um, and yeah, so I was just kind of like intrigued by that, for those reasons, I think.
Okay, so I wasn't sure whether it was a
Loose.
you have a right, but you have a sort of Forescale embroidery sideline,
Yeah, maybe
where
we've got
future
that
DTC orders will be embroidered with your name. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think embroidery is great. I just think it's fun to be like, whatever. Embroidery can be whatever the hell you want it to be,
Yeah, yeah.
whatever. People are just like, when they kind of like dismiss something, it's like, oh, I don't really like, I don't know, what's another good example? Like, oh, I don't really like wallpaper or something. You're like, okay, sure. Like, you don't like the wallpapers you've seen or whatever. But it's like, then you have a lot of companies who come in and like totally revamp like what wallpaper can
Sure.
be. And sometimes it's in incredibly like simple ways. So yeah, I think I just kind of like appreciate that. It just is just a nice reminder that like, yeah, embroidery can be a radical
Can,
feminist.
can can be cool. Okay, so speaking of, you said humble earlier, which of course brings to mind Kendrick Lamar, and the story that came out today that he's now an ambassador for Chanel eyewear.
Mm.
Um, what was it about that jumped out as a list for you?
I think I'm mostly just interested in like celebrity ambassadorships in general, which I think is like I think is I think they're boring. I don't know. It's like, yeah, I just kind of
Yeah,
boring. There's no such thing as like a celebrity endorsement in the design world. Like, thank God. Or maybe
really.
there is, but I don't really know it. Can you think of it?
Yeah,
Well, it's certainly not like what it is in fashion, which is like so much about celebrity. I think something, there was an
yeah,
article that you had in that list about like, the 1990s and kind of like techno futurism
for
and,
sure.
uh, I think, just kind of like bring celebrity ambassadorship back into that time also, which was, I think we also had celebrities kind of like on runways, not on runways, sorry, on red carpets,
Yeah,
who dressed themselves, who like hadn't used stylists, who like, you know, people who'd like thrifted things or like put things together themselves, and often they were disasters. But then when someone had really incredible personal style, you kind of like knew it was theirs. And I
right, sure.
think that's kind of like this kind of like total fusion of celebrity and fashion, I think is like very toxic for how we kind of like view personal style, because it's like now Kendrick Lamar will like only be wearing Chanel eyewear and probably full Chanel looks, like
Right.
for until he's no longer a brand ambassador, and that's just like totally boring. um I think, yeah, I think personal taste is something very precious, and I think that's
Yeah.
something that I talk about in interiors. It's like it goes back to the kind of question of like permissiveness and kind of like asking people to experiment, and I think it's not cool. I mean, this is a 1990s thing, which is like that's such a sellout. Like we're
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
thinking
Yeah. Yeah. For
that
sure.
would be like that would be so uncool. Like all of these celebrities who are like SNL actors who are like in dandruff shampoo commercials or something. It's like, how are these people still cool and they're doing like a fucking dandruff commercial,
Right.
dandruff
Right.
shampoo commercial? It's like I don't know. I think this is kind of like it exhausts me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's intriguing to think that we are the pendulum is swinging back around to the notion of a sellout moment again, right? This was something that was so strong and vivid in my youth and upbringing and
For sure,
has faded totally away.
completely.
Um,
Here.
and you know, to offer a mea culpa, like in many respects, because of an argument like the one I made earlier, where it's like, no, you have authentic cultures like skateboarding and fashion where you can have both of those things. You can have commercial and let's call it personal or editorial style together. But it does, I think you're right. It does feel like we are reaching a point where enough is enough and we have to go, all right, guys, 20% less of this was fine. 50% less of this was even better. We don't need to go to zero, but like back it off a little bit. Come on.
I totally agree. I mean,
All
good.
right. Well,
I'm sure he's getting tons of money from this, and that's great for him. But it's not. It's like I don't think it's cool.
yeah. 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 No, I'm, there are a lot of choices that he's made recently that I don't think are cool at all, but that's, people remark upon them. So that's our job as analysts. All right. Well, anyway, David, we have spent a really fun hour together. Thank you for bringing me into the Forescale world a little bit, and obviously everybody listening too. We can find you at forescale.substack.com. Is that right?
Yeah, that sounds right. Or-scale.com, both of those things. And I'll say that we're doing the second print issue. There'll be a party at the Ace Hotel in Brooklyn on the 21st of May. Everyone is
cool.
welcome to join at some point.
Yeah,
soon.
please.
I'll post an invite on Instagram, social media.
There we go. All right. Well, we can't escape social media, but we can come together IRL to, at the very least, have a drink and laugh about it. Cool. Well, everybody, thank you for listening. This has been Sick Talk number 100 with David Michon from Forescale, and I don't know what to say. David, thanks. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, guys.